This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What's happening is quieter than that and more dangerous. There is a rule in this country so basic we almost forget it exists. Federal power is supposed to apply evenly across states, across voters, across disagreement. That rule is being tested. Not loudly, not with tanks or speeches, but with money, with delay, with selective absence. What looks like dysfunction is something else, a slow experiment. What happens if access to public resources becomes conditional? Not on law, but on loyalty. You don't feel it all at once. You feel it in gaps, projects that stall, support that evaporates, silence where there used to be structure. If you think this is about politics, you'll miss it. If you think this is temporary, you'll miss what comes next. Stay with me. Because the mechanism behind this is already in motion. I want to slow this down for a moment, because the danger here is not personality. It's control. The system no longer moves primarily through legislation. It moves through choke points, funding approvals, permits, discretionary delays. Whoever controls those controls outcomes without ever passing a law. This is the quiet transfer of power. From public debate to administrative leverage, from votes to valves. In theory, Congress decides where money goes. In practice, the execution layer decides when, how, and whether it arrives intact. That layer has learned something. You don't have to cancel a program to neutralize it. You just slow it, fragment it, condition it. This reframes everything you're watching. This isn't chaos. It's a sorting mechanism, not red versus blue, compliant versus non-compliant. And once governance starts operating this way, the question is no longer who won the election. It becomes who gets access to the system at all. That's the frame. Now we have to talk about how long this shift has been happening, without anyone calling it what it is. Before this shift, power looked clumsy, messy, slow. Money moved through formulas, through statutes, through rules written so broadly they felt boring. That boredom was the protection. Before, if a state qualified, it qualified. If an institution met the standard, it received the grant. Disputes happened in court or in Congress, in daylight. Now, compare that to now. Now, the most important decisions happen after the law is passed, inside timelines, inside approvals, inside silence. Nothing is announced. Nothing is formally denied. Things simply stop moving. This is the most dangerous kind of change because it doesn't feel like change. It feels like friction, like paperwork, like delay, and delay is deniable. Delay leaves no fingerprints. Delay lets everyone pretend the system is still intact, but systems don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when their guarantees become optional. This shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly enough that many people adapted, adjusted expectations, lowered them, and once expectations drop, power fills the gap. That's when the first real shock appears. Not as a headline, but as a test case. The shock didn't announce itself. It arrived dressed as a budget decision, billions of dollars, already approved, already assigned, suddenly filtered, not rewritten, not debated, filtered. Some states kept moving forward, projects funded, timelines intact. Others didn't. Money stalled. Contracts froze. Plans collapsed in midair. There was an explanation. There is always an explanation. Administrative review, technical compliance, routine oversight. But then something slipped. An admission, not in a speech, not in a press release. In a courtroom, the line wasn't legal. It was political. Funds stayed where loyalty was assumed. They vanished where it wasn't. That's the moment the system showed itself. Not favoritism, punishment. This wasn't pork barrel politics. This was negative governance, the use of absence as force. And if you're wondering how often this happens, ask yourself why a federal judge had to step in at all. Because the court didn't just block a cut, it stopped a precedent. And precedents, once set, don't ask permission to spread. Here's what makes this mechanism so effective and so hard to see. The damage doesn't land on the decision maker. It travels downward. The executive doesn't announce retaliation. It never has to. The system is built to absorb the shock silently. Money is appropriated at the top, but it's spent at the edges by states, by agencies, by institutions that don't get press conferences when things go wrong. When funds are slowed or severed, the explanation is technical, always technical, a missing certification, a pending review, a recalibration of priorities. Meanwhile, the consequences are very real. Jobs disappear, research pauses, infrastructure stalls. The pain concentrates far away from the source, and here's who benefits. The center keeps plausible deniability. Supporters never feel the cost. Opponents absorb it entirely. This is how coercion works in a modern bureaucracy. No orders, no memos, just asymmetry. The courts recognize this immediately, because if intent doesn't matter, power becomes untraceable. And untraceable power is the most dangerous kind. Blocking the cuts wasn't about money. It was about stopping a blueprint, because once this logic holds, nothing in the system remains neutral. And that's where the next crisis accelerates. The pace quickens here, because the system does. Once the first test holds, the next one doesn't wait. Funding threats spread sideways, from energy to health to elections. Short notices, abrupt reversals, programs frozen without warning. No long explanations. There isn't time. An institution criticizes policy, its funding disappears. A state refuses to bend election rules, its support is questioned. A project takes place in the wrong geography. Its permits suddenly matter. Each move alone looks survivable. Together they form a pattern. Pressure, response, punishment. This is escalation without spectacle. And that's intentional, because spectacle invites resistance, but confusion paralyzes. Courts intervene again and again. Rulings come fast. Words are blunt, illegal, retaliatory, unauthorized. That should stop it. But it doesn't end it, because now the question isn't whether this can be done, it's how many times it can be attempted before something breaks. And the next break isn't abstract. This is where it reaches you. Not as theory, not as process, as disruption. You don't see a press release announcing retaliation. You see a clinic shorten its hours. A childcare program put families on a waiting list. A local project quietly shelved. You are told it's temporary. You are told it's administrative. You are told not to worry. But uncertainty is the pressure. Because when support becomes conditional, planning becomes impossible. And when planning collapses, stability follows. This is how trust erodes, not in one dramatic failure, but in hundreds of small recalculations you're forced to make. Do I rely on this? Do I commit? Do I speak up? That's the real chilling effect. Not fear of punishment, fear of unpredictability. If this feels familiar, it should, because systems don't have to announce control to exercise it. They just have to make access feel fragile. If you want to understand where this goes, stay with me, because this isn't contained inside borders anymore. What starts as selective pressure doesn't stay local, because money moves. Infrastructure connects. Research crosses borders. When funding becomes unreliable in one place, risk migrates elsewhere. Projects slow domestically. Capital looks abroad. Allies start asking quiet questions. Is this commitment stable? Is this policy durable? Or is it provisional? Energy grids don't stop at state lines. Supply chains don't either. When one jurisdiction is punished, others absorb the shock. Delays ripple outward. Timelines slip. Costs rise. uncertainty compounds. And here's the part that doesn't get discussed enough. Once partners factor political loyalty into risk, they stop treating the system as neutral. They hedge, they diversify, they disengage. This is how influence erodes without a single treaty being broken. Not through confrontation, through unreliability. The danger isn't collapse, it's drift. And drift is hard to reverse because no one announces when they stop trusting a system. They just quietly stop depending on it. That's the context for what comes next. Because the future here isn't singular. It branch. From here, there are three paths, not predictions. Pressures. The first is adjustment. Institutions adaptent. Courts intervene faster. Congress reasserts control. The system hardens. Not because it's comfortable, but because it has to be. Power meets resistance early. Damage is contained. The rules hold barely. The second path is erosion. Nothing dramatic happens. No single crisis forces a reckoning. The tactics normalize. Delays become expected. Retaliation becomes assumed. People plan around it. Institutions self-censor. States calculate compliance quietly. The system still functions, but only for those who fit. And then there's the third path, rupture. One attempt goes too far. One block comes too late. One dependency snaps under pressure. Not a coup, a failure cascade. Funding gaps collide. Legal backstops lag. Public trust doesn't recover. Which path emerges isn't decided by intent. It's decided by timing, by how many times the system can be stressed before adaptation fails. And that decision isn't made in the future. It's being made now. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Not because it's alarming, but because it's unresolved. Systems don't announce when they cross thresholds. They just behave differently afterward. What you're watching isn't chaos. It's calibration. Courts are firmer. Congress is louder. Institutions are learning to push back. But the experiment hasn't stopped. It's only being constrained. And constraints only hold as long as they're tested. If access to public resources can even briefly be made conditional, then the idea that they are neutral is already damaged. That damage doesn't reverse automatically. It lingers. It reshapes expectations. The question going forward isn't whether this system survives. It's what kind of system survives. One where power is predictable, or one where it is personal. If you think this ends with one ruling or one election, you're underestimating how systems change. This isn't a warning. It's an invitation to pay attention, because the next move won't look dramatic either. And by the time it does, it won't be optional anymore. If you want to understand what comes next, that's where we go from here.